Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Welcome to Adweek Together. My name is Ko Im. I'm the community editor and podcast co-host at Adweek, and we love having conversations every day on here. Today, we're going to talk about resilience and mental health. But first, if you enjoy these conversations and want to support our journalism, we encourage you to start an Adweek Pro subscription. You can learn more at adweek.com/offer. and gain unlimited access to essential content and resources. With that said, we want to introduce our guest for today. His name is Aaron Harvey. He is joining us in New York. Hi, Aaron.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us. We wanted to bring you in for a multitude of reasons. And the first is because you started an agency at another time of crisis. Let's go back to 2009, 2008. Where were you? Who were you? And what did you decide to do?
Yeah, I was in Orlando, Florida, where I grew up, and cut my teeth at a small branding shop called Hydra Studio. It's now called Purple Rock Scissors. And my buddy was in e-commerce, and we're like, man, we should just really take a leap of faith and start something. I'd wanted to move to New York for a long time. So we just moved up. We weren't big agency guys. We didn't have contacts. We just spent a year crashing parties and networking and, trying to sell anything we could to get it off the ground. And, almost 11 years later, here we are now. So it's been a wild ride, to say the least.
Yeah, it's so interesting to take a leap of faith, when you're seeing a recession. What drove you, and what were some of the initial things that you worked on beyond the hustling, especially in New York?
Yeah, I think when you're starting something out, I learned something in my previous experience that you have to do first and ask later. And so we really just went all in, and any contact we could make. Our currency was infographics back then. It was like if you could design some cool infographics, and those were like the buzzing, trending thing that every editor wanted, then suddenly you worked with UPS and Fast Company to create an infographic series, but really you were just like hired to make like a small infographic by the editor. So, some of it was like just taking a risk, riding certain waves, and, obviously coming across maybe a little bigger than you actually were.
Yeah, I like the idea of selling a series or like conceptually selling a series, because then you try to think long term. What were the initial years like of building and coming out of the recession that maybe you can offer as a takeaway for anyone trying to start something new now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great time because you're forced to be creative, you're forced to innovate. I think the most important thing is keeping a very low risk profile with your own life. Like, how can you mitigate all of your expenses down to the absolute core, figure out what you actually have to live off of, and then how long that runway is, which should be at least 12 months. I mean, I remember being 6 to 9 months into starting Ready, Set, Rocket with Alex, and in my browser, I'd always have one tab open for like, positions at Huge and other shops like that, because I was never sure we were actually going to generate enough money to make it happen. But so just getting your risk profile as low as physically possible, trying to spot some opportunities that maybe you can only see from your purview when you're starting from scratch and you're not out, trying to service all these accounts and keep the lights on in different ways. You actually have a competitive advantage right now.
Yeah, and I like that even though you took a leap of faith, you had one foot kind of a little bit tiptoeing out the door with that tab open. I get it because, as an entrepreneur, as a startup person, you have to, really bootstrap and think about your finances. I have a financial analyst friend who says, right now is the time to really, really save. So it's very courageous to hear about, starting something new. By the way, I just want to welcome our audience on LinkedIn. If you have any questions for myself or especially Aaron, please drop them down, and we love getting all those questions from you. I want to kind of go into the current. What kind of things are you working on now? What kind of work is out there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that we've seen a little bit of a hit on brand building activities versus, a hardcore reliance on performance marketing, to drive revenue. So, that combined with an investment in infrastructure projects. So, where things like websites, applications, and other digital infrastructure still remain very important right now, contrary to like maybe how media is getting slashed right now. So, we're really excited right now. We're working with some sports leagues, which is always really fun, and helping them to try to reinvent what this looks like digitally, especially with no one in the stands. Or we're working with, big real estate company and figuring out, oh, you represent all of these small different businesses who don't have the reach. How can we potentially roll all of that up and give them the voice and the reach and everything that they need to, best service that community and those businesses? Or even on the B2B side, like when you used to go to a physical space and show a machine and how it works, like how do you do all of that virtually? So really what we're kind of tasked with right now is figuring out how can you use web, live, stream, digital infrastructure to help, meet communication goals and drive sales effectively.
Yeah, I started out this conversation thinking that we were going to talk about resilience, but I'm slowly shifting towards risk. So as you work with these industries that are immensely changed, right? But we don't have live sports. B2B doesn't have like physical in-person touch points. Are you seeing brands and companies being open to risk and innovation and new ideas and experimentation?
I think it's, again, I think it's a little bit on our side. We've seen less of the, let's make the big branding investment, and more like how can we get to brass tacks, like performance-based marketing. So if it's media, it's got to be return on ad spend, or if it's digital, it's largely like, can I create a utility or a tool that will help to improve operational efficiency in a time when our resources are strained, or better service a customer through some type of, either automation or some type of like digital touch point that makes things a bit more efficient. So that's where we're seeing a bit more. That's
really interesting. What's it been like to work through the pandemic from concrete boxes in New York?
It's tough. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. We've had the human toll and the economic toll hit us. One of our partners lost some family members, and it's kind of hit our family hard. And economically, we've definitely seen projects pause, big drops, et cetera. And I think one thing that most people don't realize is that, the average agency only has about 1 month of cash on hand, only has, a line of credit, and maybe 90 days of really good cash runway. So what we're seeing is like, normally when you would take risks for 90 days out as an agency owner, you're hedging those a little bit because you're not seeing that ramp up of sales inquiries coming. Not that you're closing them, but you need that pipeline up, and everyone's being very cautious. So I think it's very much a day-to-day decision. We're in a fortunate position where we are booked and we do have work, and we're very grateful for that, and we haven't had at this point to make any hard decisions. But it's tough time.
Yeah, we hear that, for everybody, not even in marketing, of, just trying to take it day by day. I do want to point to one question from Nick. He asks, Aaron, how are you seeing the change in content creation types for brands, film, animation, and micro content?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of even just restructured a lot of what we've been kind of helping brands with. A lot more like short form animation, short form video content. We've seen a total democratization of the ability to create things the same way we're creating this as if it's a TV show. So that's created a lot of opportunity for brands to just pump out tons of content. We've talked to even stylists and photography representation companies that are out there like staffing stylists with influencers virtually to style their bathroom properly. So there's a lot of scrappiness, and I would say like all scrappiness is welcome right now, because consumers are now more open to this fidelity of creativity.
Yeah, let's start switching over a little bit. Being creative can be difficult in quarantine, especially when you might be suffering, or having mental health as a challenge. I want to bring up, the World Health Organization's definition for mental health as mental health can be conceptualized as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. We know that usually in a normal day or a normal year, that 1 in 5 Americans or so may have a mental disorder in any one year. This is a challenging year and a challenging time. How are you dealing with this time from, a mental, emotional, creative standpoint? And what are you hearing from your fellow creatives and marketers, since you do have a nonprofit called Made of Millions?
Yeah, it's no doubt it's a tough time. I think, there's kind of two things to look at. One is like people who've had chronic symptoms, chronic conditions their whole life, which can then be exacerbated by what's happening with COVID. And then there's just the onset of symptomology that maybe someone is experiencing for the first time and can be very, very scary and overwhelming. So whether it's the compounding effect or it's all things happening at once, not to mention relationships and other things can be difficult for people right now in this environment, job losses, there's so many different factors. That it's no doubt an incredibly stressful time. We recently partnered with Crisis Text Line, and they were even sharing how much that their in terms of their data is showing that the increase in inquiries they're getting on text messages right now, which in one way is a good sign, people are reaching out. How much of that is surrounding topics of COVID? So it's really difficult, and it's very hard as an owner to play two sides, which is we have to protect our agency and our asset, but we also need to protect the mental health of our employees. Our employees are all concerned or scared. What happens if this client drops and I'm on this account, or this happens? So you're kind of having to jump between both sides, right? And that's very stressful. And then of course it can compound, your own. I'm pretty open about my own mental health. Struggles. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I am too. And, I'll be super vulnerable here. I'm a highly functioning depressive and have had a traumatic childhood. So what this time can bring up for a lot of people, as you said, compounding maybe already existing conditions, but also if you're suffering job loss, with over, 3.3 million Americans out of work, and then you're suffering the loss of a loved one, or you're worried about a loved one, or you're worried about losing a client, that brings in anxiety and depression. So I want to actually help normalize the conversation as it is Mental Health Awareness Month. And I want to play out a campaign that you put together, and then we'll talk about it.
Cool.
No one told me everyone has intrusive thoughts. No one told me they can make you anxious. No one told me if I try to make them stop, it will only make them louder. If I try to act normal, it can only make things worse. No one told me I'm one of millions. So now that you know, who will you tell?
Yeah, time to really try to close the gap or help the gap from widening. We have a comment from Samantha on LinkedIn, and she says, some creatives I've noticed have gone into complete robot sale mode. We have to remember that people are humans. It's certainly a difficult place to be. What else are you hearing from the community of Made of Millions, Aaron?
I mean, we're fortunate to have built, a global community. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that people suffer for so long in silence. And it was something that we wanted to tackle this month, was this idea of, a public health crisis where, we as citizens have just been failed entirely by the public health system. And we haven't received that education. And especially when you look at underserved communities, it's much worse. So we're seeing, 10 years plus, depending on the condition and the study you read, on average, to seek help for the symptoms you're experiencing. So really the campaign is just more of kind of a, hey, we know that you're out there. We know that you're experiencing this right now and you probably haven't shared it. So it's just a way to try to get people involved in the conversation that, you know, reaching out to a crisis counselor, you know, going on a website, getting educated, learning how to be in the driver's seat of your own recovery. All that is like incredibly important. And I think lastly is that there are really valuable skills that you can be learning and building right now during this time that can make you more prepared for things like COVID and whatever might come next.
Yeah, definitely seek professional help, but you can also, you know, have a community to feel supported and have a conversation, you know, with your loved ones or with professionals. I love this, that there are so many different stories that you're sharing of people who didn't realize that, you know, this had been longstanding, or this had, you know, been, you know, feeling so intense for so long. And I want to bring up an infographic that you have on your website to maybe help, you know, enlighten some people who might not realize even what they're going through. So this is really good. And we talked about infographics, that this is a really colorful one, but it's also very telling in terms of, okay, you know, you might be hearing that your coworkers or a family member is exhausted, or and that's could be a symptom of depression, or you're feeling tightness of chest, and that could be a symptom of anxiety. And I think, you know, this is not just COVID-19 anxiety, but it could be certainly amplified and accelerated at this time. So, Aaron, what do you do to help yourself? Tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, you know, I can have hundreds or thousands of intrusive thoughts a day that are very unwanted and very uncomfortable, spanning all kinds of violence and horrific things. And it took me over 20 years before I even Googled what I was experiencing. So in the last, you know, 6 years of kind of going through the ringer, figuring out what's going on, and getting skills, I've realized that I'm actually in a better position than most people now to tackle this, to face this crisis. If you're worried every moment of every day that you might, you know, murder your partner or something like that, this doesn't feel as crisis, as that immediate urgency, like, oh my God, am I going to harm someone that I care about? So some of those things that are super important, I know it sounds generic, but mindfulness is just such a critical component. I think first is this bigger idea of accepting uncertainty. That's just such an impossible thing for human beings. But the more that you can accept that there are things that you can't control and there's a certain uncertainty to all of that, then you can sort of step back and say, well, what are other things I can do proactively, right? Even as an agency owner, what are the things I can do? Well, I can make sure we have enough cash runway. I can make sure we just do that. But I can't sit here and worry about whether or not we're going to be business in 6 months. It's a complete waste of my time. It chews up my insides. It's just not necessary. So mindfulness can really help with that. There's also another technique that I might recommend some people research called exposure therapy, exposure response prevention. So the idea is that, you know, there are certain stimulus that you have, which could be triggers for anxiety of any kind, PTSD, OCD, generalized anxiety. If you have those triggers, sometimes it's actually better to welcome them in intentionally, imagine experiencing them, and let your body go through that process of like habituating. And what happens over time is you just sort of, the thoughts are like grinding back here or up here in your way, but they just sort of become more translucent. They have more of an opacity to them where they don't block your view. They're just kind of happening and you're seeing through your view. So, you know, between mindfulness and some, you know, research around exposure therapy and things like that, it can really go a long way to help you cope with uncertainty in times like these.
Yeah, and what mindfulness does, it takes you away from the anxiety of the future and the depression of the past, and it keeps you in the present. So for me, you know, I also had some meditation and yoga, mind-body practices to help me cope through. But, you know, if you're new to this kind of space, then even just, you know, sitting with yourself for 10 seconds, 30 seconds, and then the next day, maybe a minute or 2 minutes. It's a muscle and a practice to build, you know, that is one way. Or maybe it's, you know, I like to say even gardening or painting can be like a mindful relaxation techniques that helps you drop out of the busyness of the brain and get back get back into your body and get back to you. And then the other thing I was going to say is, to look forward. I said to be in the present, but also to look forward with visualization. It kind of tricks your brain into thinking that it's actually happening when you imagine something. So even if you go back to like a peaceful place, your favorite place, or imagine that you're going to go there soon, and what are you packing? Like that's also, I think, a fun way to exercise.
And the idea of acceptance, like, I'll go down 1,000 paths as all of us will, right? But I accept the fact that 6 months from now, our agency will be bankrupt. I will have lost my shop, and I will be in Costa Rica surfing indefinitely or whatever. Like just actually going through and just accepting all these worst case scenarios. My family member could get sick. Like if anxiety is chewing you up, like it's worth doing that, even though it's hard to do, because again, it's just a state of habituation.
Yeah. So I want to end on something else. You noted surfing in Costa Rica, which I think brings you joy. What else are you looking forward to as you look into the summer for the industry and for Made of Millions for that?
Yeah, one thing about the campaign, the No One Told Me campaign, is like it was an idea that I had like 3 weekends ago, and was just like, let's make a spot and let's just ask the community. So right when I had the idea, I was like, hey, does anyone want to participate in the campaign on Instagram? I don't have like a huge following, but it's enough. And so everything you see in that spot, or in the whole campaign, including the voiceover, are people from the community who've been affected by it. So there's no photography, there's no nothing. It's just an idea. And I think what I'm excited about is seeing what ideas are strong enough that they don't require the level of not just like production, but also bureaucracy and all the other things that we are accustomed to in this industry. What are the ideas that are going to really pop out in the next 12 months from this creative community? I think it's going to be really, really, really fun to watch.
Yeah. I'll be watching right with you. I will not be in Costa Rica just yet, but I will be surfing my thoughts and surfing the web a little bit. Aaron Harvey from Made of Millions and Ready, Set, Rocket, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone in our audience who joined us for this episode of Adweek Together. Tomorrow, Senior Editor Doug Zanger will be joined by Natalie Kim of We Are Next, which will help emerging and junior talent and students get those resources as they head into the job market. Again, if you don't have a subscription yet, we encourage you to go to adweek.com/offer to help support our journalism and more great conversations like these. Thank you so much and have a great day. Take care.